So here with me today on this Extrasode number 3, we have Dr. Kathryn Ready, who is an associate professor in the English department of the University of Winnipeg. Thank you so much and welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So we are talking about the time machine and the time traveler as a mad scientist. So can you tell us a little bit of the role of the so-called mad scientist in literature?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of debate about, when exactly the first mad scientist appears in literature. So many would argue that it's Victor Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was published during the Romantic period in 1818. But, there's sort of precursors that have been cited, long before. As far as, the role of the mad scientist, I mean, I think Victor is a great example of the kind of ambiguity of this figure. I think, there's a way in which you can make a strong case that he's a hero. And some would suggest he's a variation on what's sometimes called the Romantic Overreacher. So, the Romantics were all about, the sort of boundless power of the imagination and, set your sights high. It doesn't matter if you fail. If you don't, you're essentially dooming yourself to mediocrity. And that Romantic Overreacher character has been seen as a reaction to neoclassicism and that sort of tragic figure who is meant to be sympathized with, he did set his sights too high, but it was for, the purposes of benefiting humanity. And yeah, we're sort of meant to identify with him. But on the other side, I think you could argue that he is the kind of anti-hero and maybe even a villain. And some have made the case that he, and not the monster, is really the one who's responsible for all the people who die in the course of the novel. Or at the very least, Victor is, not very sympathetic in his inability to take any share of the responsibility. So that, is sort of already, we have this division in how people think about Victor. And I think some have thought that the mad scientist is ambiguous because of two different influences that are sort of going into him. So the sort of figure of Prometheus, that's in the subtitle of Frankenstein, and he was this kind of overreacher character, but he was doing it for the purposes of benefiting mankind. So he steals fire from heaven, and then he's punished by the gods for that. But the other influence going into the mad scientist that's often cited is Adam, and that's also clearly in Frankenstein. And if you read the mad scientist that way, it's forbidden knowledge that he's gone after. And as a result, he's basically brought all the evils into this world. So, just in those two sources of inspiration, there's a kind of a tension there in terms of how we're supposed to read the mad scientist. The mad scientist is usually a man. And then, that also may be part of the ambiguity, because there's sort of, there's heroic qualities in, certain kinds of masculinity, but then he's also egotistical, refuses to listen, is detached from other people, wants power over other people.
That's really interesting. Has there ever been a woman who is a mad scientist?
In the literature, they're it's certainly in the 19th century. I think there's like one example in the 19th century. And then in the 20th century, in particular, when you get into film and television, there are way more women. And it's interesting, in the literature, the mad scientist sort of gradually becomes more unsympathetic. But then when you get into popular culture in the mid 20th century, you start to get the example of the nutty professor, so that, and, the mad scientist, interestingly, could be a figure in comedy. And then, you also get, sort of more sympathetic examples. So, Walter Bishop in Fringe would be kind of an example where he's a sort of tamed mad scientist, where he's basically well-meaning and kind of, sort of harmless, although he does end up doing a lot of, harm. But you at least like him, as a character. Yeah. And then, in cartoons, so Princess Bubblegum in Adventure Time is an example of a mad scientist, but she's kind of very, very likable and relatable as a character.
Cool. So do you have a favorite mad scientist in literature?
Well, you see, that's the thing. The mad scientist is can be not very likable. So it's sort of hard from that point of view. I mean, they're doing interesting things, but do you actually like them? I guess that's another question. I think probably the ones who start off in the early 19th century, because they still have some more of those hero qualities. They are more likable. So Victor is is way more likable than someone like Herbert West in Lovecraft's Reanimator, who's actually murdering people in his experiments. So Victor, there may be narcissistic motives, but he's not trying to actually harm anyone. I really like Dr. Jekyll because I think he is relatable. That idea of trying to get away with things that this very sort of rigid sort of moral Victorian society is not sort of allowing him to, and there's the possibility he might be closeted, gay. That is sort of held out as a possibility, although not confirmed. And then he does feel really, really badly when Hyde actually really starts hurting people. I mean, he's already doing it fairly early on. He tramples the child, but it's when Hyde actually commits murder that that's when Dr. Jekyll just wants to kind of put a stop to it. But by that point it's too late. It's Hyde is out of control, and so he is, I think, in some ways more of a victim than again Herbert West or Dr. Moreau in in Wells' Island of Dr. Moreau.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah, Wells, he's got a lot of scientists messing around with things in his.
He does.
Yeah. So looking now at the time machine, we've just listened to chapters 5 and 6, and we're being very careful to avoid spoilers. But we do know that the time traveler has just escaped the underground tunnels of the Morlocks. So does the representation of the time traveler up until this point in the novella fit the mad scientist model?
Yeah, I think that he does and he doesn't. I think there's also that, scientist as heroic adventurer that's there in the mix. And you've got other contemporaries. You've got Jules Verne's, and you've got Arthur Conan Doyle, who are creating examples of literary scientists who fit in that mold. So Journey to the Center of the Earth, and then The Lost World would be sort of two examples where you've got those heroic adventurer scientists there. But the time traveler is very close to Victor and to Dr. Jekyll in a lot of ways. I mean, he's socially isolated. He's a quote unquote confirmed bachelor, like, Dr. Jekyll. The only sort of social connections he seems to have, it's a group of men whom he invites over essentially to talk about the work that he's doing and to show them experiments that he's conducting. So they're not even really close friends. They are more like acquaintances. And there are other things about him. So the sort of physical description, he's described as having a pale face and a queer, broad head. And it's interesting because the sort of discourse of Victorian science, evolution and degeneration has sometimes been connected with the mad scientist. So he has this kind of overdeveloped brain that, you know, makes him this kind of oddball in certain ways. You get the Gothic in the description of that journey to his laboratory. So, you know, the long drafty corridors, and the mad scientist has been, you know, connected to the Gothic anti-hero slash villain, and you know, the laboratory of the mad scientist has often been compared to the Gothic castle. So I think there's that. So he describes himself explicitly as not a literary man, and that's really interesting because the mad scientist has often been connected with the separation between the humanities and the sciences, and you've got the academic disciplines that are established in the kind of 19th century, and universities that are built where they've got a faculty of science and a faculty of humanities. And you've got C.P. Snow in the 20th century, who talks about the two solitudes of the humanities and the sciences. And so the mad scientist has been seen as a kind of reflection of that, although maybe also an engagement, you know, with that.
Yeah.
And I guess there's another point that you could make. I mean, he does have this kind of egotism and confidence in his own intellect, the sense of superiority, and also the sense of science as something that's going to fix all of the world's problems. So, you know, he thinks that there has been this period in time in the world's history when everything has been fixed, and although ironically that's kind of led to you know, the Eloi and the Morlocks, you know, sort of you know, no longer retaining full humanity, because you need something to strive towards in order to kind of do that.
Mm-hmm.
So that, I think, is interesting as well. But you know, he imagines that at some point before this moment that he's arrived in, that there was a kind of utopia on Earth. And actually, you know, when he initially, you know, is first coming out of the time machine and encounters the Eloi, he sort of thinks of it as a utopia.
Because we are talking about this kind of maybe utopia that he stumbles upon in the future, the year 802-701 or something like that. His relationship with the Eloi are very interesting. This is the group of people that he comes upon. They cover him with flowers. They welcome him to eat with them. And he's very determined to learn their language. And what do you find interesting about what we might call a scene of like this as a first encounter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that phrase "first encounter" is really apt. And you know, what came to my mind immediately were the 18th century travel narratives describing, you know, European explorers going to the South Pacific. So, you know, French explorers like the Comte de Bougainville, Joseph Banks, James Cook, you know, British explorers, and you know, they describe Tahiti in particular as a sort of an island of Cytherea or of Aphrodite, and you get all this kind of pastoral language that is sort of there in these descriptions, and you know, that idea of utopia again that is there. I think what's sort of interestingly different is that the Eloi are not really sexualized in the same way that the Tahitians are in those travel narratives. And it's more a kind of fatherly or paternalistic relationship that the time traveler develops with them, and particularly with Weena. So that is, I think, really kind of interesting. And to him, they are almost like children. And so maybe that idea of romantic childhood and innocence, as well as you know, that the kind of discourse of the quote unquote noble savage that could be, you know, there in that kind of description of first encounter as well. But yeah, it's a very, you know, it's a much more positive kind of reaction that he has to the Eloi. And he doesn't, at least initially, seem to have any impulse to dominate and control them. Like he is trying to understand them, although there's a question, I guess, of whether that would have remained if he'd not gone, you know, if he stayed in the at that moment. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting to think about. And also the Victorian idealization of childhood, and having that be something that he is seeing in the people he comes upon. So that's the Eloi. But can we talk a little bit about fear and disgust and the time traveler? So the Morlocks inspire both of these responses in him, and they're not really the kinds of responses that we tend to associate with science. So can you talk a little bit about that response?
The time traveler's reaction to the Morlocks is definitely not very scientific. I mean, it's this sort of visceral, you know, sort of disgust and hatred that, you know, is provoked. And I think it's particularly interesting, you know, if he, given that he's sort of theorizing about how the Morlocks and the Eloi might have, you know, sort of come to be, if they are the have-nots from the Victorian, you know, the descendants of the have-nots from the Victorian period, then his reaction is all the more perplexing in many ways. And also given Wells's own background, you know, he didn't come from an elite background. You know, his mother was a sort of domestic servant. And you know, his father had, you know, lots of trouble earning money for the family too. So yeah, so that, and he essentially wouldn't have had schooling if you didn't have you know, some sort of opportunities that were starting to open up for working class and impoverished students, that enabled him to, you know, study with Huxley and actually get a good education.
Yeah. So that's interesting that his response to these under earth dwellers is so I guess it's not Wells's response, but is his.
Yeah, and that's always an interesting question, is to think about, you know, where the author is in relation to you know, the sort of narrator. Yeah, the narrative structure really, I think, sort of conveys that idea that there's a sort of distance. So you've got actually that unidentified first person narrator who is the one who tells us about this sort of group of men who all meet at the time travelers, and who's sort of the one that, you know, sort of gives us a physical description of the time traveler and the little details that we get.
Yeah, that's interesting. So do you think the time traveler is giving a response that maybe is just generally would be a general response anyone would have coming across these Morlocks, or
that's a really interesting point, and it's so hard to tell because he's the only one who encounters them, and so we get it entirely from his perspective, and we have no real you know, sort of measure and reference point for the perspective that he's offering us. You know, it could very well be a reaction to the Morlocks, but we'll never know that because he traveled by himself.
Yeah, that's an interesting point too, is that we have only his perspective on it.
And, you know, there's that uncertainty that we have, from the beginning, it is all of this quote unquote true within the sort of narration that we're being offered, or is there a trick, a sleight of hand, that's sort of the doubt that's kind of put in the reader's mind through the frame at the very beginning. Is any of what the time traveler tells us true, or did it actually happen, at least within the sort of context of the fiction?
Yeah, yeah. That framing is so interesting. It kind of it helps Wells so much when we talk about it. It's like, well, we don't know for sure because there's that extra narrator who's telling it from the, it's a second person where it's like twice removed the story.
And that's another way in which this novel is, I think, channeling the Gothic. In the Gothic, you often have what's referred to as the fantastic in the treatment of the supernatural elements, where it's not entirely clear, one way or another, whether the events that are, described actually happened. So, you've got the found manuscript trope, you've got, often these framing devices that underscore the sense of we don't really know what was going on here.
Yeah, great. I love that, channeling the Gothic, especially for a time traveling into the future story. So taking things from the past. In a general sense, what do you make of the time traveler's approach to exploring this future world? He is an inventor, he's an adventurer, but how scientific is he? Like, how is he using scientific processes when he's exploring?
Yeah, again, I don't think he is very scientific. I mean, he doesn't undertake any surveys, he doesn't collect any samples. So yeah, there's no, kind of natural history that's being conducted, while he's there. I think, you could argue that he remains scientific in the sense that if he's a theoretical scientist, sort of first and foremost, and he becomes an inventor because he wants to prove his theory that time is a fourth dimension. And so if you think about him in that way, theoretical scientists are a sort of different breed, unto themselves. And, maybe it just didn't occur to him. But you do sort of think if he wanted to come back and convince anybody, that he would have brought some physical evidence back. And, he sort of talks about bringing Weena, but, that is, is something that's left up in the air. So yeah, I think you could argue that this is sort of more of the fantastic that, sort of at play. So, of course, if he had brought some physical evidence, and then, the sort of audience, but at the very least, there's not a lot of physical evidence that, and he doesn't seem primarily interested in that. He seems to forget all about it, that maybe if he is going to be believed, then he should be backing up his story or something.
Yeah, it's not very scientific. His science went as far as building the science or the time machine, it seems, and then he just became an explorer, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. So he had this theory, he invented this incredible machine, the science of which is kind of left in obscurity. So we don't quite know how it is he developed this machine. There's a little bit about quartz, which, is kind of thrown in there. And, then when he actually goes on this trip, he seems to forget about science altogether. So
I have a final question for you. Do you think that scientists will continue to play an important role as characters in literary works in the future? And would it be fair to say literary interest in science and scientists is timeless?
That's a really excellent question, and a hard one. There are, sort of critics who have suggested that, going back to the very beginning of prose fiction, you have imaginative writers who have taken an interest in science. So if you think about, a writer like Lucian, he writes a narrative about a voyage to the moon, which, you could argue, because it's somewhat satirical, that it's a little bit different, but medieval romances, some have suggested that magic, and the kind of aesthetic of wonder that you have in medieval romances might be connected to early developments in science, and essentially the kind of layperson's response to science in being dazzled by it because they don't understand what's going on. I think by the time we get to Wells, the relationship between literature and science is very different, because of that separation between the humanities and the sciences. Mm-hmm. And the mad scientist narrative that can be seen as itself in a critical way in relation to science, although maybe there is some wonder there still, and some sort of tribute to the feats of science in this literature. But I guess, as far as will this interest continue, the fact that we just have become more technologized, science has become ever more present in our daily lives, at the same time as there's a lot of it we don't actually understand. I don't see the interest in science going away in literature anytime soon, and I think in fact it is kind of performing this very valuable role in thinking through some of the ethical dilemmas that are being raised sort of all the time by different scientific technological developments.
Mm-hmm, yeah, seems to be a character that will stick around in future works. Although the time traveler, you're convincing me, is not very not very scientific, although he seems to have that kind of background.
No, and he is, I think, that blend of explorer slash sort of mad scientist, and it's hard to know what Wells was up to, and how deliberately he was trying to create this character as a blend between the two. Yeah. I think Wells also, he was someone who felt very free to kind of do whatever he wanted and to kind of experiment in his own way. Wow. As a writer. And I don't think he saw himself as having literary pretensions necessarily, although, he is, now often thought of that way as being, part of a sort of high art tradition, but he was, a popular writer in his own day. And that kind of gives you a certain license as a writer. You're trying to, sort of appeal to your readers. And so, you can mix in different elements and not really necessarily be too worried about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that I haven't asked you about?
We could talk a little bit more about evolution. That was the only thing that I was thinking about.
Oh, yeah.
So I could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, yeah.
So, one of the things that I think is distinctive in, Wells's treatment of the mad scientist is that engagement with evolutionary theory. Mm-hmm. And, also the sort of neo-Darwinian idea of degeneration. So the idea that evolution can go in different directions, and that, in the Victorian period, got caught up in sort of pseudo science of race and actually class as well. So that idea that, the sort of working poor were potentially on this track to degenerate, as well as having racialized forms of degeneration. And that is one of the interesting things about the Morlocks is they're sort of evoke white gorillas, that kind of image. I think at the same time, they're not as big as the time traveler is. So they've kind of become, sort of diminutive, like the Eloi too, and made me think a lot about, descriptions, particularly of the working poor and the Irish, because there was a lot of anti-Irish racism in the Victorian period. And in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Hyde is pale and quote unquote dwarfish. I mean, he's sort of undersized as well. So in the descriptions of the Morlocks, I was very much reminded by the descriptions of Mr. Hyde in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Oh, great comparison. That was great. You've given me, and I think everyone, a lot to consider when we, as we move forward, but up until this point too, and think about and kind of consider some different perspectives and ways to think about the time machine and the time traveler. Yeah, as mad scientist or not, or a blend, whatever. Yeah.
And it's also, to me, just a great adventure story. I mean, it really does, sort of hold up that way. I mean, it is fairly exciting, to read.
I think it was Dr. Christopher Keep I spoke to earlier, and he was saying they used to call them scientific romances, I think is the term. So it has both that, it's got a romantic adventurer kind of feeling to it, exploring into a far-reaching place, and just kind of got this romance involved, but scientific.
Yeah, in the whole history of the novel, that kind of tension between realism and romance is something that continues, and it's where does a particular sort of example fall in the continuum of realism and romance. And the Gothic, I think that's also in the sort of on the romance side of the spectrum, as well as these kind of adventure stories that you get. Robert Louis Stevenson, I mean, as well as writing Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I mean, he was writing Kidnapped and definitely lots of adventure stories.
Yeah, they go hand in hand. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today and talking about mad scientists and giving us a lot to think about for the rest of the novel. Thank you so much.
It's been really fun. Thank you again for having me.